You can't describe the feeling and being really inside of a monument that has just been discovered and is just literally emerging out of the ground.
For over 1,900 years, the fate of Rome's legendary Ninth Legion Hispana remained one of history's darkest unsolved mysteries. A battle-hardened force that once thundered across Europe simply vanished. No graves, no records, no survivors. But in 2025, an unprecedented discovery beneath the Scottish earth shattered centuries of speculation. What archaeologists found didn't just answer the question of where the Ninth went.
It was initially a Roman amphitheatre, and it becomes the symbol of Rome. I have to ask the question, why?
It exposed a cover-up so shocking, it shook the legacy of the Roman Empire itself. The Vanishing Act. Formed during the late Roman Republic and forged in the fires of civil war, Legio IX Hispana, the Ninth Spanish Legion, marched under Julius Caesar himself during the Gallic Wars. These were no green recruits. The Ninth was part myth, part war machine, known for iron discipline and unmatched endurance. For nearly 2 centuries, they were the sharp edge of Roman expansion. They crushed rebellions in Spain. They held the Rhine against Germanic incursions. They stormed through Britain under Emperor Claudius, quelling Boudicca's uprising in a campaign soaked with fire and blood. Time and again, the Ninth had been sent where the empire needed swift, decisive violence. And then, somewhere between 117 and 120 AD, they were gone. Gone without glory. Gone without explanation. The first signs of unease surfaced in the records of Roman bureaucrats. Lists of stationed legions, typically precise, suddenly omitted Legio IX Hispana. At first, it seemed like an error. Surely such a storied unit hadn't just vanished. But soon, other signs of deliberate omission emerged. The legion's name was absent from stone inscriptions where it should have been mentioned. Monuments were left incomplete. Coins and military annals made no reference to it. Even Hadrian's monumental wall, constructed just a few years later to seal off the northern frontier, made no mention of the Ninth, despite their presumed involvement in earlier northern operations. The empire didn't just forget legions, especially not legions with nearly 200 years of service. Whispers began. Then, and now. Anderson Cooper recently reported on new findings, hinting that the mystery has finally been solved. But what exactly did they find? What really happened? Was it a catastrophic defeat that Rome wanted buried? A mutiny? A political purge? Hard to say, that is, until 2025. Damnatio Memoriae. Over time, the silence around the Ninth became louder than any trumpet of war. Scholars would later call it the most infamous disappearance in Roman military history. Theories about their last whereabouts abounded. Some historians believe the legion had perished in Judea, others in Armenia. Both options were technically possible. In 132, the Jews of Judea rebelled against the Roman Empire in what is now known as the Second Jewish Revolt. The Romans suffered heavy casualties in this war, and soldiers of the Ninth Legion might have been among the victims. However, another legion was stationed in Judea at the time, the 22nd Deiotariana, usually based in Egypt, but sent to fight in support of the empire according to several sources. It is possible that both legions were destroyed by the Judeans, but this would make the Second Jewish Revolt the worst Roman military disaster since the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, AD 9. The likelihood of such a tragic event not being documented either by accident or on purpose is rather bleak, according to the experts. Another theory suggests that the Ninth Legion might have been employed in the Parthian War fought under Emperor Marcus Aurelius between 161 and 166 against King Vologases IV of modern-day Iran. According to the sources, the Parthian army surrounded and annihilated an unspecified Roman legion in Armenia. At the time, there were already 2 legions in Cappadocia, the 12th Fulminata and the 15th Apollinaris. Both units were confirmed operational beyond AD 200, so neither could have been the legion destroyed by the Parthians. The Ninth could have technically been the one, even though other records suggest that this legion was somewhere else entirely at the time of the Parthian War. And even if they had been in the Middle East at the time, why had their names been erased from all records? Why had an entire Roman legion been wiped from history? Over the years, historians started believing that the disappearance of the Ninth was not just an unfortunate event, but a deliberate decision from the Roman Senate. They might have suffered a fate known as damnatio memoriae, a disappearance from memory, only reserved for people who had gravely offended the Roman Empire with their behavior. But how could a military legion offend Rome? And how could an empire make hundreds of soldiers disappear without a trace? The former question might need more time to find the correct answers, but the latter might have a chilling explanation, and it is connected to the last known location of the Ninth Legion. What if these soldiers had never returned after their last known assignment? What if they were still there, hidden, buried somewhere no one would ever look? The last known location. The final confirmed position of the Ninth was the cold, windswept fortress of Eboracum, modern-day York. In the early 2nd century AD, Eboracum was no backwater. It was one of Rome's most important military hubs in Britannia, the staging ground for all northern campaigns. Stone walls, granaries, and temples stood as symbols of Roman might, but just beyond them lay wild territory that refused to kneel. To the north stretched the lawless lands of Caledonia, home to confederations of tribes Rome could never fully subdue. Dense forests, jagged highlands, and chilling bogs provided perfect cover for ambush and guerrilla warfare. Roman patrols that ventured too far often vanished into the mist. In 108 AD, inscriptions confirm the presence of the Ninth at Eboracum. One notable find, a stone slab bearing the legion's name, was discovered during excavations near the fortress walls. It reads like a mundane dedication from a soldier, yet it would become a crucial timestamp, a final footprint before the fog. Historians believe that sometime between AD 117 and 120, the Ninth was deployed on a northern expedition, likely to subdue renewed uprisings among Caledonian tribes. What happened next is the heart of the mystery. There are no Roman records of their return, no casualty lists, no survivors, no evidence of incorporation into other legions, standard practice when a unit was disbanded, not even a dishonorable mention in any military punishment logs. Some argued the Ninth may have been reassigned to another part of the empire, perhaps the Rhine frontier or Judea. But this theory collapsed under scrutiny. No epigraphic evidence supports it. If they were transferred, why erase their name from the records in Britain? Why scrub them entirely from the stone fabric of Rome's empire? It was as if the Ninth had walked into Caledonia and never walked out. Adding to the intrigue, Hadrian, upon becoming emperor in 117, abruptly shifted Roman policy in Britannia. Instead of conquering, he pulled back. In 122 AD, he commissioned Hadrian's Wall, not as a springboard for invasion, but as a defensive border, a retreat, a containment. Some scholars now suspect that Hadrian knew, that he understood exactly what had happened to the Ninth, and that the wall was not just a military decision, but a tombstone. Had they finally found them? And what would they see if they searched deeper? Finally, in 2025, new forensic scans beneath the Scottish peatlands would reveal something Rome had worked very hard to bury, and it wasn't just bones. The 2025 breakthrough. It wasn't a seasoned archaeologist or a military historian who unraveled the first real clue to the Ninth's fate. It was a drone, and it was by accident. In January 2025, a joint team from the University of Edinburgh and the European Institute for Advanced Archaeological Technologies was testing a new AI-assisted LiDAR system over the Cairngorm Mountains, a remote, often snow-covered region of northeastern Scotland. The mission had nothing to do with Rome. The team's objective was to model glacial runoff patterns and their role in Bronze Age settlements. But on the third day of scanning, the drone returned anomalous data. A massive rectangular signature, far too precise to be natural, buried beneath centuries of peat, forest litter, and mineral-rich stone. When filtered through spectral imaging software, the outline sharpened. What they had found was unmistakable and chilling to consider. A Roman marching camp, but not just any. The dimensions were staggering. It spanned over 20 hectares, enough space for nearly 5,000 men. The camp bore every hallmark of emergency construction: deepened defensive ditches, hastily elevated ramparts, and irregular post placements, suggesting the camp had been assembled under extreme duress. This wasn't a staging ground. This was a last stand. Within hours, the site was flagged for excavation. The first physical breakthrough came near the southwestern quadrant. Fragments of scuda, the rectangular Roman shield, shattered as if by enormous impact. Nearby lay snapped spear shafts, bent iron pilum heads, and dozens of hobnails, the cleated remnants of Roman caligae sandals, strewn without order, as if torn from corpses in haste. The implications were clear. The Ninth wasn't simply defeated, they had been isolated, ambushed, and dragged to certain death. Word of the discovery leaked through an academic journal submission, and within hours, headlines screamed across the globe. Lost Roman legend found, and it died alone. Secrets in the bog, final words of a doomed legend. But while the public was stunned by the archaeological marvel, researchers were gripped by something deeper. How had the most powerful Roman legion been ambushed by tribes who often fought between themselves, and were unlikely to form an alliance against them? The demise of the Ninth Legion suggested a horror worse than defeat. It hinted that these soldiers weren't just lost in Scotland and ambushed all of a sudden. They were led there to die. The political cover-up. The Roman Empire did not forget legions. It commemorated them, especially those who fell. The disaster in the Teutoburg Forest in 9 CE, where 3 legions were wiped out, triggered a national mourning period, political repercussions, and massive military reforms. Monuments were raised, commanders were tried, but for the Ninth, nothing. No funerary inscription, no cenotaph in Rome, no Senate mourning decree, not even a public mention after 120 CE. This gaping silence began to raise deeply uncomfortable questions. Why would Rome, so obsessed with honor and lineage, erase one of its oldest and most storied legions? Theories abounded for centuries: desertion, mutiny, redeployment, but none held water after the 2025 discovery. The battle site and the bog tablet confirmed a Roman military disaster on the frontier. The Ninth had died, but not by chance. It had been deliberate and needed more attention than it was getting. The answer began to take shape inside the Acta Senatus, the private proceedings of the Roman Senate. In the wake of the 2025 find, experts reviewed neglected scrolls from the years 117 to 125 CE. What they found buried in the faded ink of these crumbling documents changed everything. A sequence of entries contained cryptic references to unauthorized mobilization north of Eboracum, excepciones ex Legione Hispana non-reported to the treasury, and non-senatorial sanctioning of cross-border engagement. In simpler terms, the Ninth may have been deployed illegally, without Senate approval, during the politically volatile transition between Emperor Trajan and Hadrian. More disturbingly, it may have been deliberately positioned to be isolated in enemy territory. But why? How could this have possibly gained them any sort of advantage? One theory gaining traction is that the Ninth Legion had become politically problematic. They were traditionalists, fiercely loyal to their general, possibly aligned with a faction opposed to Hadrian's vision of consolidating the empire rather than expanding it. Hadrian's decision to abandon territorial expansion and build defensive borders, notably Hadrian's Wall, was highly controversial. Could the Ninth have resisted? Could they have threatened to rally other legions to challenge the emperor's authority? If so, Hadrian, or his inner circle, may have taken the ultimate step: send them north, isolate them, and erase them. In this interpretation, the site in the Cairngorms wasn't merely a battlefield. It was a political grave, a place chosen not because it had strategic value, but because it guaranteed the Ninth would be surrounded, outnumbered, and ultimately forgotten. Rome didn't commemorate the Ninth, because doing so would have exposed a treacherous abuse of power at the highest levels. By ensuring no survivors, no public funerals, and no posthumous honors, the Senate ensured silence. It was the ultimate historical deletion, a cover-up orchestrated by a civilization famed for its meticulous records. The Ninth wasn't just betrayed by strategy. They were betrayed by politics, pride, and paranoia. And now, nearly 2,000 years later, their ghosts have begun to speak again. Echoes in the Highlands. Once the 2025 discovery broke into the public sphere, the British Isles became ground zero for historical reassessment and a hotspot of political tension. As archaeologists excavated more of the site, a grim picture began to take shape. The encampment wasn't just overrun, it had been systematically encircled and crushed. Weapon fragments embedded in the soil were traced to local tribes, mostly Caledonian, who had long been underestimated in Roman accounts. Blades bore intricate Celtic carvings, including symbols tied to druidic war cults, which Rome had spent decades trying to suppress. Several human remains, now being processed at Oxford's Forensic Anthropology Unit, showed signs of ritualistic mutilation, decapitations, tongue removals, and broken limbs, possibly punishment for Roman oppression. This wasn't a skirmish. It was an ambush engineered with terrifying precision, carried out by an enemy Rome thought too fractured to unite. But someone, somehow, had done the impossible. The Highland tribes, long viewed as barbaric and disorganized, had formed an alliance, and they didn't just want victory, they wanted vengeance. More chillingly, one of the Roman helmets found at the site, its bronze dented and bloodstained, had been spiked to a tree and surrounded by what appear to be carved Ogham runes. One translated to a haunting phrase: "This is what we do to ghosts who trespass." Ghosts, not soldiers, not men. Historians now believe the Highlanders viewed Roman troops not merely as invaders, but as spiritual violators. The Ninth didn't just lose a battle. They walked into a religious war they never understood. The secrets in Rome's archives. With the British and Scottish governments scrambling to manage international archaeological rights and rising tourism, a quieter, more clandestine investigation began back in Italy. Vatican archivists, aided by a special advisory council of classicists and theologians, quietly opened restricted sections of their Roman military scroll collections, many of which hadn't been seen since the Napoleonic era. What they found was stunning. Among papyrus scraps, preserved letters, and battlefield reports was a sealed dossier labeled NH, Internal Concern. The initials, many believe, refer to Nerva Hadrianus, better known as Hadrian. Inside were memoranda from high-ranking Roman intelligence officers, known as frumentarii, detailing concerns about the loyalty of Legio IX. Rumor had it that the Ninth had forged dangerous bonds with disenfranchised auxiliary tribes, including former enemies of Rome. The implication: Hadrian's administration may have feared the Ninth was not just politically unstable, but potentially a mutinous threat with foreign sympathies. That may explain why the Ninth was sent to their death, not as a military loss, but as an intentional sacrifice. And now, 1,900 years later, their legacy has clawed its way out of the earth, not as heroes, not as martyrs, but as a warning. As pressure mounted across academic and military history communities, Rome itself became the focal point of global scrutiny. Journalists from Le Monde, The Guardian, and Der Spiegel descended on the Eternal City, filing requests to access what remained of imperial Senate scrolls and Vatican archives, especially those associated with the reigns of Emperors Trajan and Hadrian, whose transitional rule marked the disappearance of the Ninth. What emerged from those walls painted a picture not of incompetence, but of orchestrated silence. A freshly uncovered Roman senatorial edict dated 119 AD, barely 2 years after the Ninth Legion was last officially documented in Britain, was located in a marble-inscribed tablet in the ruins of the Forum of Trajan. It made no direct mention of the Ninth, but referenced a restructuring of the northern garrisons due to behavioral divergence and cultural contagion. The chilling phrase "cultural contagion" ignited alarm among modern historians. It hinted at something Rome feared more than barbarian revolt: ideological spread. Privately, analysts speculated this meant the Ninth had indeed defected, partially or in whole, perhaps forging alliances or spiritual bonds with local tribes, becoming something between Roman and native. If true, the Ninth wasn't just wiped out. It had been erased deliberately, not for failure on the battlefield, but for blasphemy against Roman order, and the erasure worked. After that, there were no official mentions of the Ninth in military roles. Their banner was quietly absorbed by other legions. Veterans, if any survived, were either reassigned anonymously or executed. Rome did not forget traitors. It devoured them. The bones that changed everything. While historians pored over marble and parchment, another kind of evidence emerged from the Scottish Highlands, one that no amount of ink or politics could deny. In May 2025, under layers of peat and shale in a glen northeast of Inverness, archaeologists unearthed a mass burial site. It was not a battlefield grave. It was an execution pit. Carbon dating, artifact forensics, and isotopic analysis confirmed the unthinkable. Over 200 Roman soldiers, stripped of armor, hands bound behind their backs, in kneeling positions, still frozen in the soil. They finally found them. But what they saw was bad, really bad. The soldiers had been ritually executed, one by one. Some skulls bore precise puncture marks consistent with a Caledonian ceremonial blade, while others were smashed completely, a sign of symbolic destruction meant to deny passage into the Roman afterlife. Jewelry and belt buckles nearby confirmed affiliation with the Ninth Legion. Even more disturbingly, a piece of Roman aquila, the Legion's sacred eagle standard, was found buried upside down beneath the corpses, surrounded by blackened soil and animal remains. The implications of this piece of breaking news shattered centuries of theory. The Ninth hadn't just disappeared, they had been systematically dismantled, humiliated, and buried in a way designed to annihilate memory itself, a psychological warfare tactic employed by ancient tribes who believed memory equaled power. In other words, the Highlanders didn't just defeat the Romans, they silenced their name. Rome, unwilling to admit such a defeat or acknowledge the spiritual humiliation, buried the truth with them, until now. Fallout across the empire. The 2025 revelations about Legio Ninth Hispana's fate sparked immediate global reaction across academic, military, and political institutions. The possibility that the Ninth Legion did not simply vanish in Britain, but was instead systematically defeated and partially absorbed into local insurgent forces, forced a significant reassessment of Roman imperial history. Archaeologists and classical scholars quickly began revising long-standing interpretations of Roman military operations in northern Britain. Histories had previously relied on gaps in the record, such as the legion's disappearance from Roman military rosters post-AD 120 and its absence from Hadrian's Wall inscriptions. Now, new material evidence, burned outposts, mutilated Roman standards, and forensic remains showing ritual execution suggested a collapse not from organized warfare, but from tribal attrition and internal breakdown. Some theorists proposed that ideological infiltration or even mass defection had played a role in the Legion's final hours. More concerning to modern observers was the parallel between Rome's failure and contemporary military strategy. Several Western defense analysts noted the warning signs of an overstretched imperial force losing cultural cohesion in hostile territory. A leaked NATO intelligence memo even referenced the Ninth Legion discovery as a case study in counterinsurgency failure and psychological disintegration. Educational institutions were also affected. British textbooks that once romanticized the mystery of the Ninth now faced revisions grounded in grim clarity. Museums, including the British Museum and the Yorkshire Museum, began updating exhibits to reflect the Legion's likely demise in the north rather than speculative redeployment to Judea or Armenia. Scotland, particularly areas surrounding the Caledonian strongholds, saw an uptick in nationalist sentiment. Local leaders emphasized the archaeological evidence as proof of indigenous resistance defeating imperial might. For some, the Ninth's destruction became a symbol not only of Roman overreach, but of native resilience, a narrative with modern political implications. With the mystery of Rome's Ninth Legion finally solved, the implications extended well beyond ancient history. The findings, formalized in a joint report by the University of Oxford and Scotland's National Museum Service, reframed the Legion's disappearance as a multifaceted collapse, partly military, partly cultural, and partly psychological. These findings altered how historians viewed Roman imperial policy. Instead of portraying Rome as an infallible force constantly expanding its borders, the fall of the Ninth demonstrated how vulnerable even elite forces could become when left unsupported in ideologically hostile terrain. In 2025, nearly 1900 years after the Ninth vanished, its legacy returned not as a noble enigma, but as a harsh lesson. It became a case study in how empires collapse not just from outside attack, but from within. And in that sense, the fate of the Ninth may say as much about the 21st century as it does about the Second. What do you think about the most recent findings? Is there merit in continuing the search? Let us know what you think in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Until next time.